Whenever convenient, Republicans raise the specter of socialism as a reliable boogeyman. They use it to drum up fear among their base, particularly with respect to the Democrats' agenda. The notion of socialism creeping into American government and society has been weaponized time and time again throughout the 20th century, most recently against such initiatives as the Affordable Care Act and food stamps, or SNAP assistance programs for low-income families. It's even been used as an argument against student loan relief and tuition reduction. So, what are Republicans really doing when they stoke the irrational fears of their voter base with stories about socialism sweeping the nation? What about it do they find so abhorrent? What about it makes them flee to the safety of their McMansions and fill their boring dinner party blather with talk of impending doom at the hands of the left? What are Republicans really afraid of? Maybe they feel threatened that socialism has the potential to resonate with millions of Americans across the country, especially working-class folks demanding greater equity for themselves. Maybe they're worried the rising popularity of programs which ensure better health care and economic fairness, which signals the weakening of their own tenuous grip on power, which favors wealthy people and corporate interests. I wonder. Let's take a swing at taking them at their own word when it comes to what they fear. In the article, What Americans Must Know About Socialism, published on the conservative Heritage Foundation site, the level of hand-wringing on display over the fact that millennials, quote, don't recognize that much of what they enjoy in life is a result of capitalism, end quote, is truly a sight to behold. Clutching their pearls, they claim that socialism is a pseudo-religion grounded in pseudo-science and enforced by political tyranny. Republicans are concerned because they see the writing on the wall. A 2019 study by the pointedly titled Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation found that about half of all millennials in the United States don't actually view capitalism as a good thing. And why should they? The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development reports that income inequality in the United States is higher than in any G7 nation. The wealth gap has more than doubled since 1989. Meanwhile, things like home ownership, the ability to invest in other forms of wealth creation, are steady declining among young people. And the media love to blame the death of entire industries like terrible chain restaurants on younger people, instead of the fact that fewer people want to spend $15 on a plate of deep-fried cheese grease. I mean, God forbid you acknowledge that millennials are categorically in a worse financial position than their parents, lest you endanger the time-honored narrative of, you ungrateful kids have it so easy these days. No, instead, let's just whine about how college kids aren't buying diamonds anymore. So now might be a good time to share a definition of socialism and see if any of its critics have done actual research beyond stitching together chopped up Fox News headlines like some bedwetting conservative ransom note. Then we can unpack the rather extreme conclusions they jump to when characterizing it. Oxford English Dictionary defines socialism as, quote, a political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole, unquote. The political right loves to conflate socialism with the governments that control a nation's economy, like North Korea. This is inaccurate, to say the least. Socialism is concerned with improving conditions for the working class, eliminating wealth inequality, and creating a more egalitarian society. A better example of socialist theory in practice would be the nationalized healthcare systems of countries like the United Kingdom, Canada, or South Korea. Systems which the citizens of those countries value greatly and have a long history of defending. The truth that lying Republicans refuse to admit is that Americans who support socialism don't just see it as some empty fad like a Bernie Sanders mittens meme. This is a real movement, and it neither starts nor ends with a grumpy old man in a folding chair. In fact, socialism is as American as apple pie. There is a rich socialist streak that runs throughout our nation's history and culture. Does the name Eugene V. Debs ring a bell? He was a labor activist who made a name for himself representing the American Railway Union in the Pullman strike of 1894. Debs ran for president on the Socialist Party ticket in 1912 and garnered 6% of the popular vote. He ran 4 more times after that, and this last campaign of his was from a jail cell after he was incarcerated for delivering what was labeled anti-war speech. Remarkably, Debs actually improved on his vote total from prison, getting over 1 million Americans to vote for him in 1920. Moreover, during its American heyday leading into World War I, socialists held 1,200 offices in 340 cities, including 79 mayorships. Though the party's popularity declined for a variety of reasons, including their anti-war stance and a reactionary response to the communist takeover in the Soviet Union, socialist thought endured in the United States. Perhaps most famous of all was FDR's New Deal legislation, based on proposals authored by socialists. It aimed to put Americans back to work in order to stem the effects of the Great Depression and reform the banking system to keep such a disaster from ever happening again. 2 decades later, we have LBJ's War on Poverty, which sought to improve living and social conditions for America's poorest citizens. This, too, was spurred on in part by socialist thinking, specifically a book, The Other America, by socialist author Michael Harrington. And for those of you keeping score at home, these landmark legislative efforts have endured the test of time. The legislation introduced during the War on Poverty succeeded in reducing poverty nationwide, and only through government interventionist policy since then has it stayed down. In 2012, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities estimated that 4 million Americans were lifted above the poverty line when SNAP benefits were counted as income. And that's not even the biggest anti-poverty government program on the books. That would be Social Security, which was created under the New Deal and was expanded on during, you guessed it, the War on Poverty. So what's going on with socialism in America today? Are gangs of small-town teens banding together to fight off Cuban paratroopers descending upon Main Street? Hardly. There is no socialist threat, but there is a growing socialist movement. Despite a legacy of influencing some of the longest-lasting and most popular federal policies in our nation's history, socialism is scoffed at by YouTube intellectuals like the haunted ventriloquist dummy Ben Shapiro, who is just desperate to be, someday, a real boy.
Am I a real boy?
But in the last decade, the word socialism has lost some of its fear-inducing stigma. Even more interesting, several socialist representatives have been elected to Congress. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Jamal Bowman, and Cori Bush, all of whom belong to the political organization Democratic Socialists of America, or DSA. In the last 5 years, the DSA has grown their membership from 6,000 to over 90,000 today. So just who are these people and what do they want? Well, they believe in a wide range of policy initiatives that, if you're at all familiar with Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and other members of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, their proposals will sound very familiar, such as the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, canceling student loan debt, strong unions, dramatic criminal justice reform, and electing democratic socialists to all levels of government, among many, many others. Their ultimate goal is to unseat capitalism or to fundamentally transform it, which they view as deeply undemocratic and oppressive. And in its place, they would like to install a system with worker-owned businesses, while other interests like healthcare and utilities would be government-controlled. They believe capitalism in its present form prevents most people from living the dignified life that they deserve. In essence, they are motivated by egalitarian aspirations for a better future for all. And how are they planning on accomplishing all of these lofty goals? The answer is good old-fashioned people power. The DSA is a political organization made up of grassroots organizers across all 50 states. They are not a political party, but they do work to identify and train their membership to run for office and work to get them elected. So one way they seek influence on politics is by electing officials that represent them. The other method they use is by growing and organizing their membership into a powerful voting bloc that's able to pressure politicians into meeting their demands. In other words, they seek power through holding elected office and exercising their right to vote.
How dare these jackbooted fiends resort to tactics like representative democracy? Whew.
As to who makes up this voting bloc, well, it's probably no surprise that the DSA is aggressively growing its membership among college students and generally skews young. But the DSA has membership from all walks of life. Honestly, it's hard to tell if conservatives are more afraid of the supposed return of the Bolsheviks or just that these people don't look like the pale, dusty old lizard folk who spawned Mitch McConnell. There is no doubt that fear is what Republicans trade in. Fear and hypocrisy. The right is loath to approve government dollars to support programs that provide financial support to individuals and families, but whenever their own money is at risk, they're quick with the government bailout to corporations. For all their cries of "Beware the Red Menace," the looming anxieties that so vex the right amount to little more than political expedience when the rubber hits the road. Or at least go out the window when the bad times reach their bank accounts. Think back to 2008. It's the height of the Great Recession. Wall Street is practically blowing the doomsday trumpet, signaling the end of days if Uncle Sam isn't willing to break out the checkbook to bail them out of some of the bad bets they made on subprime mortgage assets. Enter the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, as it's better known. Born out of a law signed by George W. Bush, it allocated $450 billion to right the ship by buying back Americans' household debt and saving us from going over the cliff. Yeah, just kidding. Only $30 billion of that money was put toward avoiding home foreclosures. Meanwhile, $250 billion went to buying preferred stock in 8 of the country's biggest banks. Would the entire economy have gone into a death spiral without it? Look, experts on both sides of the aisle have argued that point. Did the Senate have to amend TARP a few months after its creation in order to prevent money from going towards executive bonuses? You betcha they did. But what's the point of getting away scot-free with causing one of the greatest crises in American history if you can't peel off a little from the top when the government steps in to save your business? Oh yeah, Comrade W. Bush gets it. Now, for those out there who consider the early 2000s the murky past when we had to do whatever we could to survive, have no fear. There's plenty of other examples of state-sponsored capitalism to go around. Like the $500 billion in subsidies that a 2015 Public Accountability Initiative report showed had gone to the sporting goods conglomerate Bass Pro. All in the name of free trade and healthy competition, right? Just ask the residents of Bakersfield, California, who stared at an empty hole in the ground where a Bass Pro shop was supposed to be built for over a decade. If fishing isn't your bag, try cheese making. Who doesn't love cheese? The government bought 11 million pounds of cheese in 2016 to stabilize the industry. Or maybe you're one of the legions of starry-eyed fanboys of Silicon Valley's wonderkin, Elon Musk. As LA Times data shows, all you need to run your very own tech empire is $4.9 billion of U.S. government support. Socialism. Yeah. Most insulting of all, however, may be the airline industries. Their decades-long legacy of price gouging while simultaneously reducing services may even outlast the story of the Wright brothers and their momentous day at Kitty Hawk. When the pandemic hit and times got tough, The airlines came to Congress with hat in hand, not once, but twice last year. First, asking for $25 billion in pandemic relief, then requested an additional $17 billion. You have to wonder how over $40 billion wasn't enough for an industry that spent even more on stock buybacks over the past 5 years. It's probably best not to think too hard about it, though, I suppose. Might drive any reasonable middle-class person with an ounce of self-respect into an
apoplectic fit of rage.
And yet, somehow a one-time $2,000 stimulus check is too much for people who, in the words of Mitch McConnell,
you don't need the help.
I guess that's capitalism for you. What I'm trying to say is the only difference between a corporate bailout and aid for American families is how they're spun. It's essentially the same concept. Need help that you can't provide yourself? I hope there's help from the government on the way. Only the right doesn't see the socialist theory inherent in corporate bailouts. Only when government funds are going to individuals are they likely to draw the purse strings tight and clench up their buttholes. I don't know about you, but I think the average American family would benefit a hell of a lot more from a little government support in uncertain times than Amazon, Apple, or Tesla. Look, you might not consider yourself a socialist or even agree with socialist ideals. And as much of a waking nightmare as American politics may be, when we talk about socialism, we aren't talking about a creature lurking under the bed. If you look at what modern socialists are working to achieve, it's hard to say they aren't at least trying to find solutions to problems that affect all of us. That's more than I can say about American capitalism. Here's a little something to chew on. A new report from Oxfam says that over the course of the pandemic, the world's billionaires increased their wealth by $3.9 trillion. That's $3,900 billion. An amount that they estimate is enough to pay for vaccines for every single living human being on planet Earth. At the same time, workers cumulatively lost $3.7 trillion in earnings, according to the International Labor Organization. How interesting that those numbers juxtaposed are so damn similar. Except going in the opposite directions. What is truly monstrous isn't the attempt to redistribute insane amounts of wealth in a more equitable way. It's the cynical, cold, and deadly indifference of those who look at our current system, shrug their shoulders, and say, it's working just fine. Unlike the boogeyman, socialism is based in reality and is not a threat to the American people, although it might just be a threat to the ruling elite and the future of the Republican Party.